The song of invitation will be 294. Song of invitation 294.
Well, it's great to have everybody here this evening, and if you're joining us on live, it's wonderful to have you with us as well. We are in the book of Amos, looking at that little book of Amos. Like we said, we talk about the minor prophets. The minor prophets are only because they're little books. They're just not big books, kind of like small pages, not a tremendous amount written. It has nothing to do with the message at all. But when we look at this is kind of an exciting book because this is a man who really wasn't a trained prophet. He wasn't from the school of prophets. He is a goat herder from the middle of nowhere. He's also from the wrong side of the railroad tracks, as we would say. He's from the southern part. So at this time, historically, we have the whole nation of Israel is divided into a northern and a southern kingdom. And so this man is coming from the southern kingdom in the wilderness area, and he's going up and he's going to stand before the authorities and the priests of these false religions and preach to them. Not going to be well received. It's kind of interesting because a lot of times we try to look and we go, well, who would God send that's the most qualified? This would not be him if we had to pick. If we were to pick people, we'd probably go, let's don't take a goat herder and stand him in front of the president of the United States, right? Let's get somebody who's credentialed. He's raw. He talks like a cowboy from the Western that you bring him in and, you don't want him talking to your mom because he's going to say it like it is. So I love that about him, that his message is true. The other thing about this book is these are not his words. This is his personality, but we need to understand that when we use God's word, it's God's word and it's his power. And that's the wonderful thing about it. So as he starts out the book, he's going to lay out the charges that God has. And like I said, I'm not going to read every one of those because they're kind of like, you get into the begot, score 3, score times 4. So we're going to look at the first 2 chapters, but he lays it out at the beginning and brings his charge to them and what God has a problem with those nations. Now, I love the way it does it. If you can think of like a dartboard and how you have like the rings around it, and when you throw, you hit the targets, and the closer in you get, then the target is the bullseye. The bullseye is what you really want to hit, right? Well, it's kind of cool because this is what he does. He kind of does it like a dartboard. He starts hitting around the dartboard and talking about those nations, Damascus, Ammon, Edom, and he hits them around. And the guys in the middle are sitting there going, yeah, that's right. Those dirty old Gentiles, yeah, you preach it, brother, you preach it. Because, yeah, those Edomites, the Amorites, the Syrians, the blah, blah, blah. And they're all looking around going, and you know what he does? He hones it in. And then, boom, he brings it right on top of them. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We used to always joke, say, you went from preaching to meddling. You ever heard that? In other words, you started preaching is good until you got personal, and then you started meddling in my life. You stop doing that. That's what he does. And so as he goes around, they're all legitimate. Now, how does that apply? Well, you know what? Let's just say that we're the center of the bullseye as a nation, and there's a lot of nations that are around us. And we easily look at them and go, yeah, China, bad. North Korea, oh, really bad. We look around Russia, yeah, really bad. Middle East, we look around and we see all the things that those nations are doing, and it's easy for us to sit there and go, oh, yeah, bring it. Yeah, they need to be. But you know what? There's a message for us. And I think that's the part that this book has hit so literal to me. Because when we listen to all the news flashes that are going on around us, and it's so easy for us to just easily sit here thinking, oh, we're this great democracy, this rich and prosperous nation and all that, and we're just so enlightened and so educated, and so God must be blessing us. Well, that's exactly the way that they felt, the northern kingdom. They were prosperous. They were in rest. Economy was booming. People had multiple houses, lots of jewelry. Their crops were prospering. There were no enemies to say. So there was nothing threatening them. Nobody could threaten them. So God must be good. So it's really easy sometimes. So look at the charges. Now, there's one universal thing that we'll see that is common, that they have all these charges. So if you're a Jew and you're sitting there going, you're looking at those who are non-Jews, you'd go, yeah, they're all non-Jews, they're all bad. So I have to always bring this up, as what right does God have to judge those nations? Well, that's a silly question in a way, but it makes sense because when you talk about who's applicable to what, who's applicable to God's law? Well, everybody, Ron. Come on, that's a no-brainer. So when we look at these judgments, what is God judging them on? What is the principle? If in law, if you're in a courtroom, a judge would say, you'd have to say, what is the point of law? You can't just pull it out of your hat and go, well, I'm just making this up. You have to say, according to Roe v. Wade or Smith versus Jones or this code and this principality according to the law, you have to have a ruling from a law, a source that's of authority. So I want you to kind of think about that as we go through. I love the way he opens it up. He opens it up like a guy that's got nothing to hold back, and he just says it so boldly. He says in verse 2, he says, the Lord roars from Lion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. I don't know. I mean, we don't have this idea. I mean, I've heard coyotes because we got coyotes out here. But if you lived in Judea, you would know what a roar of a lion is. Now, today, they've pretty much hunted them to extinction. And I think if you've seen some movies, you've seen where lions, the roar, they say it's almost, you could feel the vibration from the tone and volume when a lion roars. And he uses this metaphor in a couple of ways, but this idea of here is this lion, this big lion, and as he rips forward this roar that you could just feel, like a bass. When somebody pulls up next to you at the stoplight and your windows are rattling, you could feel that type of a roar coming out. And so this is an amazing, powerful picture of here's God roaring from where? Jerusalem. Now, physically, no, but it's a metaphor in a sense of saying it's from God's house is where it starts. So everybody's going to see it, and it's going to have an effect. And if you heard a lion roar, you would jump. You'd go, whoa, it would really get your attention. So that's what he's opening up with. So the very first, he starts out, like I said, if you had a map, you looked around, he starts talking about these different nations. Now, for time purposes, we could sit and almost connect the dots to every one of these transgressions to a historical thing that occurred. Many of those are actually in Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, and you can go and find those, and a few of them I might mention as we go through this. But the first one is Syria. Now, that's the same basic area that you imagine if you were to pull up a map today and look at Syria. Now, some translation will say Damascus. That's the capital. So when it says Damascus, when it says that, it's really talking about the idea of the capital. There's a lot of things that happen between the struggles of the northern kingdom and Syria sitting up here in the border. There was a lot of battles back and forth that went on between the two. And so the thing that he talks about is the cruelty. Now, you're already starting to see some things. Is that saying, there's nothing about this that is Mosaic law? This is a crime against humanity. This is like a war crime. Now, I don't know if what's going on in the world today, but in The Hague they have the court, and they're actually presenting, and they go there and they present the cases against nations that are atrocities that have occurred. It all goes back to Nuremberg after World War II when they took the Nazis and the Holocaust. And they tried them. And so the world tried to come up through the United Nations, this court, and you could come and bring these atrocities that have occurred. A lot of them in Africa, Rwanda, genocide, things that are going on, because they're just so bad that it doesn't matter if you're a communist, socialist, a capitalist, what background, all the world has even today agreed these are atrocious. That's what we're seeing. These are the crimes that you would take and say they're so bad. Not just, people die in war, things get blown up, things get burned. These go beyond that. And so that's the common thing they have with them. And so he describes it in terms that they would understand. Today we don't understand, some of the farming implements, but this idea of the cruelty, they went beyond just defeating their enemy. They literally pulverized them. They just, when it's kind of like a soldier when he surrenders. One of the Geneva Conventions is if he surrenders and he can no longer fight, you stop. You stop. And you give him quarter, they called it. and you take them hostage. That's a thing we were trained as soldiers. I mean, if somebody is fighting, an enemy combatant, if he can no longer fight because he's injured to the point where he can't or he surrenders, you let him live. Well, this is the opposite. Not only were they just killing to kill, but they were also inflicting it on others, and that's something that they did. Next one is Philistia. Now, Philistia, sound familiar? Philistine. The Philistine, not the same, but it's the geographic area of what if you pulled up a map today, you'd look. It's the same area, Gaza. Now, there's 5 cities, Ascalon, and these cities is a grouping there. What's interesting about the Philistines is the Philistines never really, they had 5 cities and they had different kings. They never had a conglomerate of one king. They were like a grouping of cities, but it's sort of kind of directed at them and saying about them. And what they did is they were involved in slave trade. And now you say, well, wait a minute, we know that there was slavery even in the Mosaic Law, but it's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is that they took everyone and they took them. Normally the warfare was they would take those combatants and they would take some and they would take them off and they would trade them because they didn't want those guys to come back, and be able to fight again. And so, either you slaughtered everybody or you took slaves and captives, but they were taking children, women, they were wiping entire homes, cities out, and just for profit, just because they could. And they had no concern at all. And Phoenicia is a little further north, up toward Tyre. That's one of the cities there. And he says, this covenant violation is very hidden because you probably don't really remember it. And even whenever I first read this and was studying it again, I had to go, whoa, I know what that was. This is between David and the king, that whenever David became king, he came down and made a covenant, a relationship, a treaty, saying, and he brought him cedar and he brought him material to where his son Solomon could then build the temple. And they made an agreement between each other of this peace, and that was the treaty that he's talking about here. But it was also a treaty between David and Solomon and the descendants. So we know shortly after Solomon is when the tribes split apart. They went to 2 different kingdoms, but God still saw there's a treaty there. There's an agreement that you had. And he says, you delivered up again, the same thing. Edom seems to be involved in slave trade. Those guys are. And so now Edom is in the south toward Egypt. So they're taking and the cruelty there. And they had this relationship, and God is seeing this. And a lot of times we forget about some of these aspects of morality. We think, well, it's just, governments are governments, and they're just not as good as some of the others. And no, but God sees the purity of how they're supposed to treat each other. And he holds them accountable to that. So there's a theme here. Now he turns on Edom. Now we're getting, so what did we hit? We hit on the outer peripheral of this dartboard, we hit pure Gentiles. Now he tightens it down, and these next ones are descendants. They're relatives. Remember Esau? This is Edom. They're the descendants of Esau. And so that's why he says as well, this cruelty that they inflicted upon him. He said, because he pursued his brother with a sword and cast off all pity, and his anger tore perpetually and kept his wrath forever. Doesn't that sound like his father, great-great-great-great-grandfather? Remember the anger and how hasty he was and what we have? And so he forgot that idea. You'd say, well, wait, that just doesn't seem fair. I mean, that's been so many 1,000 years. God says, no, I don't forget. That's another aspect. God's not going to forget. He's still consistent. You make a vow, you better hold up to it. And that's what we see here. You have a covenant relationship with somebody, and you have a relationship the way he's talking about Edom here. Edom was blessed because of their father. That's something we forget about. Even though he sold out his birthright and all that, you know what? These brothers and these cousins received a blessing from God because of their grandfathers and stuff. So even Lot, Jacob, and all of them. And that's what we see here. And because they pursued the brother and they were They were so cruel as well. Now, Ammon is one of Lot's descendants from the incestuous relationship after Sodom and Gomorrah. And we have Ammon and Moab. They're the brothers from the two different sisters. So they're related. They're not, God's still seeing all of them kind of this relationship. So he started outward. Remember the nations that had no relationship, and now we see it tightened down. These guys have more of a relationship, but they've always had adversity anyway. We know that. But look what he says. He said they've ripped open pregnant women in Gilead that they might enlarge their border. In other words, they wanted genocide. That's what they were doing. This is pure evil. And so we can say a lot about when it talks about protecting the unborn, but basically what they were trying to do is to basically stop any future generations and just complete genocide. The others were bad, but the other thing as we're going along, we didn't look at, but every one of these judgments are the same. It's not like in our courts, sometimes, you get, that crime's not as bad, so you get a little slap on the hand and you get probation, and then this guy's a worse crime, and he's going to do some jail time. What's interesting is all of these are bringing forward the same punishment, described in a little bit different, but it's still justice is justice. Justice, righteousness, which God is righteous, correct, requires justice. And justice is the carrying out and correcting of things that are sinful and wrong. And so why we call this justice is because God is correcting and bringing back things to being right, righteous. So, and then he goes to Moab. Now this is an interesting one because they attack Edom. Again, these are distant relatives themselves. But they also went beyond, and I don't, understand all of it, but basically we're desecrating the grave and the execution of the king of Edom. Now, that's interesting because Edom is on the bad list here, isn't it? Edom's one that's getting a pretty heavy dose because they ignored their brother. They were so horrible, and God's going to punish them. And then now God's going to punish the Moabites because they were bad to the Edomites. And you go, well, wait a minute. Isn't that kind of fair? No. You see, it's not he did it, so I did it, so it's equal. You're still going to get your just desserts. You're still going to get punished. You can't say, well, he's a bad guy anyway, so when I desecrated his king, what's so bad about that? Why are you coming after me? He's getting punished. Look how evil Edom is. God didn't work that way. You can't look around at your brother and go, wow, I'm not as bad a sinner as they are. I haven't done as bad as things. And that's what caught me was the idea of, I could see Moab like a little kid going, but wait a minute, Edom's worse than me. I was just picking on a bad guy. I just did something bad to a bad guy. No, God saw that as well. Now he tightens it down. Now remember, he is speaking to the northern kingdom, Israel. So he still hasn't hit the bullseye. So the northern kingdom, they're not getting along. They've never really got along with the southern. So now when he talks about Judah, they're still, now it's getting a little uncomfortable because now you're getting real close to us. But remember, he's preaching this lesson, this sermon up north. Now, and this is where they share. This changes. The other ones were all, I would say, crimes against humanity or crimes against the less fortunate and those that were poor and just going beyond, going into barbarism and things, crimes against humanity. Now, God turns and he focuses on the last two, his direct covenant relationship, descendants of Abraham, and now it's about this covenant. What I think that grabbed me is that it's as well the same judgment that he's given all of them. It's not, it's a little worse in some ways. It depends on how you judge that. But God is not letting them off the hook either, just because they're his covenant children per se. And he says they reject the law and they have not kept his statutes, but their lies have led them astray, those after which their fathers walked. This is a generational problem. Obadiah, We looked at that, and this is another prophet that prophesied around the same time. And that was something he said. He talked about how this was going to come on. He goes, you need to remember, you should be passing this on from generation to generation to generation and remind them of the punishment that God can bring upon us so they don't go and sin again. And again, it's that the old saying, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Well, this is what happened. The generation in Judah, they just followed after their fathers. They didn't learn the lesson from them. Now he comes to Israel, and it gets very specific with Israel. Not only, but it's common, when he says transgressing their law, but now he gets very detailed. He talks about this idea of being bribed, giving up what is right for some money. Give me some money, and I'll make it good. It's okay. I don't care if it's right or wrong. Just give me some money. And so they're selling it. So whenever the judges would make a decision and it was right, correct one, you could just give him some silver and he'd change. And so this is reference to that type of justice. And the needy for a pair of sandals, well, what's a pair of sandals? It's pretty sad. You'd sell them for something that's really, it's the foot, so it's the idea of how bad they are, that they would even not only just give up things that are right and correct justices for bribery, but they'd also do this to those that are needy. And then he continues, the next charge he has against them is trampling. He calls it tramp the head of the poor into the dust of the earth. That's pretty graphic. Basically not just beating them down, not just repressing them, but literally just destroying. This is getting rid of the lower class, or getting rid of a class of people. And turning away from the way of the afflicted. Don't have no compassion, in other words. And then another one that's so grievous is this idea basically of what we would call, temple prostitution worship. And that's what he's talking about, is that they would go to a temple basically and have this type of a relationship that was so defiled. So they've completely walked away. And now this gets interesting because the way he describes this is lying themselves down by the altar on the garments taken in pledge. Now, the Mosaic law said that if you take a man's garments or coat in a pledge, that regardless, by the evening, I need to give it back to you. Yeah, it's really interesting because it says in there, what's he going to have? He needs to have something to keep warm. You can't take the guy's coat if he says, hey, I tell you what, just let me give you my coat. I'm going to go take care of something. You've got to give it back. It doesn't matter, because what we're referring to is a necessity of clothing, protection. And that's what he's showing. So a Jew would understand that phrase directly because it was written and taught to them. And what's ironic is they're taking it into the very place of sanctimonious sacrifices, and they have the audacity to have that coat, in which should have been given back, right there beside God's altar. And so that's that kind of like irreligion that they're really bringing upon them. And then in the house of God, they take and drink wine for those who have been fined. The corruption is unbelievable. Now, in verses 10 and 11, we'll pick in there about despising the goodness of God. A lot of times we look at blessings and we miss them sometimes. And so, but that's not the same as despising them. Things in which you know where they come from and the way you treat them in disrespect. So in 10, he says, and also, I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you for 40 years in the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up some of your sons for prophets and some of your young men for Nazirites. Is it not indeed so, O people of Israel? Am I not the one who helped you, who got you out of bondage and brought you in and protected you? And I took some of your own sons and turned them into speakers for me, and even set some aside under that Nazirite vow, declares the Lord. But you made the Nazirites drink wine and commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. In other words, stop telling the truth. And these Nazirites were, remember, don't cut hair and they can't drink fruit of the vine. So you're taking it and you've completely desecrated the very beautiful thing that he has worked to bring you into. Behold, I will press you down in your place as a cart full of sheaves pressed down. Now that's kind of weird, but it's almost like a truck loaded full of concrete is going to press down the weight upon you. You know, it's crushing. And he describes all these different things he's going to describe in this. Is there is nobody that has any ability to put this off, escape it, defend, or protect you. You're not going to bring in the Delta Force. You're not going to bring in the Navy SEALs. It doesn't matter. John Wayne isn't going to be resurrected and be able to help you. Doesn't matter. If I had to roll that up, that's what he's saying here. Because listen, he says, flight shall perish from the swift. In other words, you can't get out of town. The strong shall not retain his strength, nor shall the mighty save his life. He who handles the bow shall not stand. In other words, those who can shoot they're not going to be able to. He who is swift of foot shall not save himself, nor shall he who rides a horse save his life. And he who is stout of heart among the mighty shall flee away naked in that day, declares the Lord. Even the ones who are really proud, look at that, they're really like, yeah, I'm courageous, are going to run away naked crying. That is awesome. I mean, just imagine this goat herder standing before the king using this type of language. I wish that we could appreciate that culture and some of like these language, like press you down like a cart full of sheaves, press down. But I think the last one there you can see. This is the way that they would be listening and hearing this. It's very rough. This is not a smooth message at all. And we're going to stop there. We'll pick up 3 next week and start there. So if you want to go back, read, connect the chapters together, we'll continue on. So if there's anybody here, we always offer this opportunity that if you're with us, there's something we can do to help you in your relationship with God, that we'd love to have an opportunity to pray with you, establish a relationship, or whatever we can do, because that's what it's about. Ultimately, we can come together, we can worship, we can praise God, but if we're letting somebody go that has a need that we can help with, shame on us. So that's why we do this. And I actually have known some places where they've stopped offering an invitation, and it's like, so shocking. It's like, and I've asked one time, just kind of being polite, I said, so why would you even consider that? Well, nobody ever responds. I said, how do you know? I mean, because it's not about making yourself known when we give this invitation out. What it's about is you and God. That's what it's about. So, because I know when I started preaching, I used to get very discouraged. Like, nobody ever listens. I do the invitation. I do the invitation. I do the invitation. And I realized it's not about me. It's not about us. It's about you and God. And so that's why we always, regardless, will offer an opportunity to pause and reflect, and then correct or be encouraged. So if there's anything we can do for you, let us know while we stand and sing.